when I first went down to Carolina in 1995, it was really to work training camp and see what happens. It wasn't like I was offered this full-time job. So I just did whatever would come up. Driving players to the airport when they get released. Not a fun job, by the way. Driving players to get MRIs. Things weren't automated computer-wise like they are now. So I did a lot of typing. Every time the waiver wire would come out, we'd have to manually type in every transaction into our database. There were just a lot of things that had to be done. And training camp ended. And honestly, nobody told me to leave. So I just kept coming in every day like I was a full-time employee. And I think and after a while, thought I really was.
Field Talk Podcast is presented by Roback. If you see me anywhere, I'm usually wearing something from Roback. They make pretty much everything that you need for your closet, including, of course, polos. I'm wearing one as we speak, plus their signature hoodies. They've got joggers, they've got shorts, they've got hats. By the time you hear this, there's probably a new product that will be launched that I haven't even heard about myself. But to check out Roback, go to RHOBACK.com, Roback.com, and to get 20% off of your first order, enter the promo code FIELD, my name, FIELD, at Roback.com. Becoming an NFL GM is really, really hard. For starters, there's 32 total jobs in the entire league. Beyond that, there are probably 32 million people, give or take a few, who really want to be an NFL GM. As a matter of fact, I remember in my days of scouting, one of my jobs when I first got started was to filter through the mail and read resumes of people who wanted to come work with us. It was clear to me then that the odds are really stacked against anybody who wants to become an NFL general manager. But that is exactly what Tom Telesco has achieved now with the Las Vegas Raiders and previously for over a decade with the Los Angeles and prior to that, even the San Diego Chargers as their general manager. So to say that it's been a journey would be kind of the understatement of the day. But how does a kid from Western New York eventually make it to the NFL in one of the most coveted seats in all of sports, with some pit stops along the way that includes a small school in Ohio that is more of a football factory than you may have realized? On today's Field Talk Podcast, here is Raiders GM Tom Telesco. It's great to be joined by Raiders General Manager Tom Telesco. Tom, how are you? It's still like I have to remind myself every once in a while. Raiders GM Tom Telesco. I'm sure you're used to that title right now, but how has it been so far out there for you?
Yeah, it's got a good ring to it, huh?
Does, yeah.
Yeah.
You're telling me.
It's been really good. It's I've been so lucky in my career. I met with the players the first day of training camp, and it's so funny when I start off by saying this is my 30th year in the NFL, because it doesn't feel like it at all. It always seemed like I was a young guy in the room for forever, and all of a sudden I look around, I'm like, oh my God, I'm the oldest guy in the room at this point. But no, it's been really good. It's a brand new journey for me, new challenge, all new different people to work with. But it's been great. It's been really fun.
All right. So fortunately, you do not look like the oldest guy in the room. While I knew that it's your 30th year, I guess I was aware of how your journey has gone in the NFL. 30 years still, I don't buy that. I am going to pretend not to believe that. But I didn't want to sort of go through your journey. You work in one of the most coveted seats in all of sports now as an NFL general manager. And I'm sure there's somebody every single day that asks you how to become a GM or whether you have a job opening available for that person. So I wanted to rewind and kind of figure out where it all started. You grew up in Western New York. At what point did you have aspirations to maybe do something in football and potentially one day be an NFL GM?
I think my journey is probably atypical to some others, because when I was a kid, I never had a dream of being a GM. I never had a dream of working in the NFL. I hadn't even thought about it. And I'm a kid that grew up, in the 80s, late 80s. I was in high school, late 80s, early 90s, or actually late 80s, I guess, college, early 90s. I don't think there was as much focus on working in professional sports then. If there was, I didn't see it. I was just a fan of sports. I played football, basketball, and baseball growing up. Huge NFL fan, huge Buffalo Bills fan, obviously, growing up.
Yeah.
And, but I was more like I followed the players and the coaches, and I watched the draft as a kid, but I more watched it to see who the Bills were going to take. I didn't watch the draft thinking, boy, I would love to do that someday. So a lot of my journey just kind of happened, a little, a lot of luck. I just so happened, I went to the same high school as the sons of Bill Polian. And at the time, when I was in high school, Bill was the director of pro personnel for the Bills. So he wasn't the GM yet. And honestly, even at that time, like, I didn't even know what the director of pro personnel was. I had no idea. Actually, funny story. So Bill Polian, before he became GM, he was a pretty high-level college basketball referee coming up when he was younger. Yes, he was. So, but by the time he got to Buffalo, he had to kind of dial back on the college referee work. But he still did high school games. He did AAU games. He did grade school games. He probably reffed at least 2 or 3 of my basketball games when I was a kid. But so, not that I knew him real well, but I knew his sons, both Brian and Chris. And honestly, I'm at John Carroll University. I'm playing football there. And my freshman year, I get a call, and it wasn't from Bill, it was from somebody else. And they were looking for some college players to work training camp for the Bills. And actually nowadays we can't even employ NCAA athletes in training camp. You can't do it anymore, but they were looking for people to do it. And for me, I was a huge Bills fan, number one. And number two, I just thought I could learn some things to be a better player. I never decided to do it just because I thought it could lead to a full-time job. I had never even thought of it. I was more like, hey, I'm a big Bills fan. I think I can learn something there. Charlie Joyner was the receivers coach at the time, Hall of Fame player. Ted Marchibroda was the offensive coordinator. He was, well ahead of his time in the passing game. And I did a lot of odd jobs in training camp, but one of them was kind of hanging out with the receivers and kind of making sure Charlie had his script for the day, his drills all set up. I was snapping. I was a 7-on-7 snapper for Jim Kelly and Frank Reich. So I'm like in the huddle listening to the play call. It was great, but never thought even at that time that this would lead to a full-time job. I did that for 3 summers.
So your time in the NFL certainly trumps mine by a long, long time, multiple decades worth. But whenever I get asked by young people sort of how do you break in, I often tell them that if there was like an easy route, a 5-step plan you could follow, I'd share it with you. But as you just described, there really isn't one unique path or one path everybody must follow. But you mentioned John Carroll, which I'm going to ask you about in a minute. But before we get there, you mentioned going to the same high school as Bill Polian's sons, but also maybe kind of an NFL factory or a football factory, which included a current NFL head coach, Brian Daboll. So at the time, did you have any sense that maybe some of your classmates may end up in the NFL, or is there something in the water at your high school that has led to the success that several of you have had in your NFL careers?
At the time, no. It wasn't even a thought. But, when you look back, we're all a product of who we learned from. I learned all my X's and O's in football from my high school coaches and college coaches. And we had an outstanding high school program at Buffalo St. Francis. And Brian Daboll was a year behind me. But we just learned a lot of football, and they really invested in the kids there, which is so important. To have high school coaches invest in their players. And our high school coach, Jerry Smith, he really tried to get kids to college, to play football in college, whether it's Division 1, 2, or 3, NAIA, it didn't matter. He put a lot of work into that. And who knew? Brian Daboll, Chris Polian, Brian Polian, myself, Dave Caldwell, also St. Francis High School. It's all who you learn from, and then how hard you can work, and then like a lot of luck involved as well.
So that probably is like a much deeper roster of future NFL coaches and executives than many high schools, probably like 99.9% of them. And then you follow that sort of pattern to John Carroll, which for those that don't know John Carroll in Cleveland, Ohio, is or has become one of like the incredible breeding grounds for future NFL executives and coaches as well. What is it, 2 or 3 of the current NFL GMs, Nick Caserio down in Houston, of course, yourself, Dave Ziegler, now in New Orleans. There are a lot of you all over the NFL. Is there something specific, and there's coaches too, by the way, there's all sorts of John Carroll people in the NFL. Is there something about the program there that maybe you think has helped contribute to this success? Because Otherwise, I'm having a hard time exactly figuring out how all these John Carroll guys have become so successful in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked that a lot, and it's just funny because it's been a long period of time of different, front office coaches, and we all kind of came in different ways. It wasn't like a couple people got in the NFL and just started hiring more John Carroll alumni. It really wasn't how it worked. Even when I graduated from John Carroll, Greg Roman also graduated the same year. We both ended up with the Carolina Panthers right out of college, completely different ways. I arrived there basically because I had interned with the Buffalo Bills, and the Panthers were an expansion team, and Bill had to put together a whole staff of people and knew some people that worked for the Bills, and I kind of hooked down there in the summer. And then Greg Roman really came in as a strength coach initially, totally different path, and then moved his way into coaching, moved his way up. And then it kind of took off from there. And then after, our classes after us was like, Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler and Nick Caserio. And, I don't know, like Division III football, obviously you're not playing for the full scholarship. So you're playing for the love of the game, which, you can probably say that at every school, but I really felt like at John Carroll, like they treated the program like it was a Division I program. Like a lot of effort went into it, a lot of resources. We had a great coaching staff. It was a high-level program then. It's really turned around now. It's really, a top 10 NCAA Division III program. But I feel like after maybe, 3 or 4 or 5 of us ended up in the NFL, I think after that, I think more kids just saw, hey, there's opportunities there in the NFL. You learn football in high school, you learn it in college, and then you try and, you send out some resumes and you hope somebody bites and you can land an internship somewhere. That's usually the hardest part. It's just getting your foot in the door is the hardest part. And I think after that, these kids from John Carroll kind of saw, hey, look, there may be a path there to work in the NFL.
And so that first full-time job for you, that first full-time step into the door, as you mentioned, was in Carolina in a role, scouting assistant. It's kind of day one, bottom of the totem pole in the world of scouting. And I joke, Tom, that people, when they ask me about like, oh, what was it like to work in a scouting department? I'm like, I scouted like a little bit, but like most of my jobs were like driving guys to and from physicals and picking up players from the airport at 1 a.m. Eastern time or something like that. So what goes into, or what were some of your responsibilities at the beginning of your NFL journey that I'm sure feel like a very, very distant memory now as the man responsible for building the Raiders roster?
Yeah, but you explained it right there. I mean, when I first went down to Carolina in 1995, it was really to work training camp and see what happens. It wasn't like I was offered this full-time job. So I go down there, and it's expansion team. We're in a temporary building. And I just did whatever would come up. And a lot of these would come up through the course of the day that we weren't sure who does what. But it was, like you said, driving players to the airport when they get released. Not a fun job, by the way.
Yeah, not fun.
Driving players to get MRIs, driving them to the doctor's office, rolling the tarp out onto the field. But then also back then, like things weren't automated computer-wise like they are now. So I did a lot of typing, whether it was typing play scripts into the computer, whether it was typing into our database rosters, height, weight, speed, date of birth, all the way through. We had to type in every time the waiver wire would come out, we have to manually type in every transaction into our database. So there was just a lot of things going on. Honestly, if it wasn't an expansion team, I'm probably not there because there were just a lot of things that had to be done. And training camp ended, and honestly, nobody told me to leave. So I just kept coming in every day like I was a full-time employee. And I think and after a while, thought I really was. But yeah, it was just a lot of those odd jobs. And then on the side, I got lucky. Our director of college scouting was Dom Neely, who was a longtime scout, longtime college director, legendary guy. His office was in the draft room. And when I wasn't doing all these other odd jobs, it was to kind of be with him. And I had this little, I wouldn't even call it a desk, it's probably a little table in the draft room. And, I'd make, profile tapes of the prospects. And actually my first year, Dom had torn his Achilles. So he was in the office all the time. He wasn't traveling. So I had a chance to watch him read college scouting reports, take a red pen and make corrections to them. And he would kind of talk to me as he was reading the reports and how to write a report and what you're looking at. And then I'd make profile tapes and he'd kind of critique them. And he was tough, like really, really tough, but I learned a lot. And so I would kind of do that when I wasn't doing the other things. And that's kind of how you learn. And you work really hard, you keep your mouth shut, you listen, and, a lot of times good things can happen that way.
So between Bill, of course, Polian, and Dom, that's two sort of tough love mentors that you got the privilege to learn under. Bill, who I work with at ESPN, is one of a kind. That's probably the easiest way to describe it. So you start to move up the ranks in the world of scouting. And of course, this is year 30 for you, as you mentioned, in the NFL. You're now at the top of the personnel heap as a GM. Are there things that you maybe felt like were areas that you stood out, or things that you did that helped you rise through the ranks? There are a lot of young scouts around the NFL who would love to one day become a GM, but there's 32 total seats. Can you pinpoint sort of maybe it's moments or things that maybe you felt like were important to your career success?
Yeah, what I did was whatever job I had, I just completely focused and concentrated on that job. And I never really concerned myself about moving up the ladder. It's a very competitive business. Not only if your team doesn't win, you're usually out of work, but just within the team, like if you can't contribute to winning, they're going to go find somebody else. So whatever job I had, I made sure I did it the best of my ability, tried not to make the same mistake twice. And I think that did help me. And then, when I was in Indianapolis, we won a lot of games, and, I kind of moved up the ranks, and it just kind of happened organically. But what I was lucky with too is honestly, just the location of my office. Like my office was like 10 feet from Bill Polian's door and Chris Polian. And, I learned, so I could kind of see how the sausage was made. So, because the job of the GM is so much more than scouting. It's much more of, a broad-based, leadership job. But watching Bill and Chris, how they work with the coaches, agent negotiations, how they work with the league office, how they work with the athletic trainers, obviously scouting part of it. I mean, how they worked with the media. So, I was just kind of privy to all that. And Bill had an open door policy. And he, for me and for Chris, when we were younger scouts, like, he would ask our opinions on a lot of things. And I would give him my opinion. Really, he shouldn't be listening to me at all, but he always listened. Didn't necessarily mean he was going to agree with it. But a lot of us young people that were there, myself, Chris, Todd Basveri, who's still with the Colts, he really taught us a lot, and he really went out of his way to teach us. And so I kind of learned the whole aspect of the job just in 15 years being there. A lot of it was just based on the location of where I was located and the fact that he took a real interest in all of us.
So the golden rule of real estate applies to NFL personnel office as well.
Location.
That's right.
Yeah. I got very lucky with that.
Yeah, well, it's such a competitive industry that any edge you can gain is really important. So you eventually reach the seat of becoming a general manager in the NFL, with many, with many important stops along the way, being around and maybe the greatest or one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, and Peyton Manning, and that era of Colts football, which is so special in so many ways. But when you become a GM, I have heard this refrain frequently from people who are young in their GM careers, which you've been doing this for a long time now, so this is probably another distant memory of yours, but did it surprise you how different the job was than what you had been doing for nearly 2 decades worth of NFL work?
I was lucky enough that, I'd watched Bill for so long, so I had a pretty good feel what the job entailed, but obviously a lot different when you're in the seat making the judgments and making the decisions. The only part of the job I hadn't done at that point was the media aspect of it. And that you just kind of have to learn on the run. There's no way to prep for it. At least at that point there wasn't. But yeah, it's different when you're in that seat. But like I said, I was lucky I was well prepared, but you never just prepared for everything. Like the first year, I just remember with the San Diego Chargers at the time, first year, the first 6 months, it was more about survival. And there were just so many things going on. And I remember I was just trying to do a lot. And I think whenever you're a first-time GM, when I got hired, I just felt like, they hired me. I need to do everything. That's why they hired me. And I figured out really, really fast, you can't micromanage this. You'll be very poor at it, or at least I would be very poor at it. So just got to make sure you hire the right people, hire really talented, good, hardworking people, give them a vision, and just let them work. But it took me some time to figure that out, to really kind of delegate out, because that was my first thought, was it hired me to be the GM. I need to run this whole thing. And I'd watch Bill. I mean, Bill is, he's a Hall of Famer for a reason. Yeah, and then after the second year, where you can now anticipate things that are coming along, things start to slow down a little bit. And honestly, when I took the Raiders job, even though I'd been a GM for 11 years, I kind of felt like I was a first-time GM again. Things are moving fast. I got different people I'm working with. And I know here when I arrived, I learned a lot, from the last 11 years, and you learn from what works and what doesn't work. When I realized when I got to the Raiders, I'm like, look, we have a lot of new faces. What are new faces to me, because you're responsible for a lot. So I told, training, equipment, scouting, strength staff, whatever it is, coaching, I said, look, I'm going to adjust to you guys. Like, I'm new here, and I'm the only person. I don't want everyone else to have to adjust to me right now. I'll adjust to everybody else. As we move through the spring, move through the summer, yeah, there'll be some adjustments and changes. We'll get all on the same page. But I try to, hey, look, let's make one change instead of making a lot, which is me kind of getting adjusted to everybody else. But, it's managing a lot of people. It really is a people business, really much more than a football business. Just, football is, our job, but it's a people business first.
So the average football fan certainly knows that a GM is responsible for running the draft, right? You're the one that has to make the decision on drafting Brock Bowers or drafting Justin Herbert or any of the other players that you have drafted during your time as a general manager. And of course, big trades and roster reductions and things like that. But there are lots of days in the year, and there are lots of responsibilities go on that. Do you find that over the course of a calendar year, there is some consistency and you kind of have an expectation of what May 7th looks like for you? Or, a dozen or so years into this, is there still sort of the expectation for a curveball on a daily basis?
Yeah, there's both. There's kind of a cadence to the job depending on the time of the year, and then in the fall, really the day of the week. But there are always curveballs, fires to put out that you didn't anticipate when you walked in the door. Makes the job fun. The job is never boring. It's never monotonous. But yeah, there's certain cadence to it. And I have especially in the fall when, for myself, there's just a lot of little things you're working on. But I also kind of want to incorporate where I can actually do some scouting too. I mean, that's also part of the job. It's not the biggest part of the job, believe it or not. I mean, it's, we have a great staff of pro scouts and college scouts. But I have to kind of stay on pace. And so I kind of have a plan during the week, but you also have to know that everything you had on your list to get done on a certain Wednesday, in October, it may all change when something else pops up. And that's just part of the job.
This has probably crystallized more for me since doing, a draft role at ESPN, is the idea that I can spend all year trying to get ready for the forthcoming draft class. You also have to manage a roster every single day. You're, of course, going to practices during training camp, probably some during the regular season as well, traveling to games, being a dad and a husband too. There's a lot more that goes onto your plate. So it's fascinating to hear that scouting you do maybe less of than people might realize, but it's one of the realities of being a GM on the scouting front. We all, I think, whether you're a GM, a draft analyst, or just a fan, we all love the draft. And one of the reasons why we love it is I think it offers hope. You've drafted a lot of high caliber players, Pro Bowlers, All Pros, etc. I'd be curious, though, we don't have to be specific to a player, but I always tell people that there's so much more than just maybe what you see. It's easy for us to find the eye-popping highlights or stats and say that guy is really good, and they probably are in some cases really, really good players, but you're making an investment in the person. How did you sort of learn that process of identifying what kind of individuals you want to make a draft pick? And in the case of early first rounders, at least until NIL money became a thing, changing their financial fortune overnight, which if you told me at 21 that all of a sudden I had $10 million in my back pocket, I don't know what I'd be doing, but I would not be doing it as passionately as far as playing football goes prior to getting that money.
Yeah, it's a really involved process. I mean, in the end, it's humans evaluating other humans. So it's an inexact science. And how they play football on the field is a big part of it. There's no doubt, but it's not the only part of the puzzle. I mean, there's a lot of other things that go into it. And it seems like there's more and more every year. And in the end, we're just trying to, increase our odds of being successful on the player. We're not going to be right 100% of the time. We're not going to be right 75% of the time, unfortunately. It's closer to 50. And if it's 50, you're really good. So we're just trying to look at all the other factors that go into that. Everything from data analysis to psychological testing to scheme fit. And there's a lot of people part of this process, along with the GM. You've got the director of player personnel, you've got the college director, you got all the area scouts, you got cross checkers, you got the head coach, you got assistant coaches. And then you've got, team doctors and team security and psychological testing. And I'm probably even missing some things. And you're trying to put that whole pie together. You take in all that information and then you make a decision. And you like I said, we're trying to increase our odds and trying to know the highest probability that player can be successful. But taking all those opinions, it's which actually is part of the job I probably like the most, is kind of running those scouting meetings, the back end scouting meetings once you have all the information, and then talking about the draft board. And every player has strengths and weaknesses. There's no perfect players, but it's a pretty involved process. It's more than just watching the tape. I wish it was just that. It'd be probably a little bit easier, but it's not. It's just the way that it is.
Yeah, no question about it. There's so much more that goes into it than just what you see on the film. I feel like I've learned that one myself the hard way a handful of times in some draft evaluations. Not to get philosophical here, but to kind of put a bow on this as we wrap things up or get close to it. Obviously, winning fuels everybody in the NFL, players, coaches, GMs, and everyone in between. But are there other parts of the job? You just mentioned, those meetings for the draft as an example. They kind of continue to fuel you on a day-to-day basis, that 30 years in, things that maybe you were doing back in your early scouting assistant days still bring you like the same level of joy and passion as they did when you first got started?
There's no doubt. I mean, I've been on a team every year since I was probably, 7 years old. And there is nothing better than being on a team. There just isn't. And this is why, in mid-December when I got let go from the Chargers, I'm thinking, okay, what's my next step? Like, I kind of I like being a part of this. I like being a part of things, and which even I like more is, leading things, which I've had a chance to do for the last 11 years. So that never gets old. It really doesn't. When you grow up in Buffalo, New York, first of all, it never gets old living in, either Southern California or Las Vegas. That doesn't get old. But it doesn't get old working in sports. I mean, I grew up as a kid, just loved all sports, but also loved football. And to get a chance to do this for this long for a career, I mean, that doesn't get lost on me. But working with people with a common goal to put together a team to go win a game. If you win the game, you celebrate it for 24 hours, you come back, you're ready for the next one. And if you lose the game, you try and figure out what went wrong, you talk about it, you come back and you fight again. And there's just no better feeling than that. There's the other side of it. It's not the most stable business in the world. And there's pressures that go along with it. And, it's not always easiest on your families, but, the benefits that come along with it, probably far outweigh the hard parts of the job. And I've been so lucky. I'm so lucky to be at the Raiders right now to still be doing this. I'm doing it with great people. So I've been really lucky in my career.
Well, Raiders GM Tom Telesco, who somehow, and I think I'm going to have to go fact check this after this conversation, is into year 30 in the NFL. We really appreciate you joining us here and telling us more about how you got to the seat that you sit in now, because I'm sure there's somebody out there listening that probably one day aspires to do the same. We thank you very much, and best of luck with everything going forward.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Field.
I really enjoyed the conversation with current Raiders GM Tom Telesco, and appreciated hearing about how he went from a guy who didn't actually think he was going to work in sports at a very young age to then becoming an NFL general manager. Tom has always been one of the most thoughtful and sharpest evaluators in the entire NFL. Also a good person to learn from for those out there that maybe are interested in pursuing a career in sports, but also whatever career you're pursuing. It's a good reminder that persistence, hard work, and being willing and open to do whatever it takes is usually a good recipe for some success. And thanks as always for listening to the Field Talk podcast, wherever you get your podcast. And if you're so inclined, we always appreciate a rating and subscribing to the show. We like positive ratings. Those are always fun. But We also want your honesty. So whatever you think, go check it out. And of course, a big thank you to Roback, RHOBACK, for making it happen. And a reminder to go check out roback.com for all the incredible gear. Until next time, we'll talk to you again soon on the Field Talk Podcast.